The Observer decided to publish an article by Howard Jacobson entitled "Tales of Infanticide Have Stoked Hatred of Jews for Centuries. They echo still today." In it, Jacobson says that those who highlight Israel's slaughter of children in Gaza are perhaps subconsciously, he does argue, spreading blood libel myths about Jews. Now, Jacobson says in the article, even when there are other explanations for the devastation, no one really believes them. Reporters whose reports are proved wrong see no reason to apologize, no amendment of their calumnies. What is there to apologize for? It could have been true. Ask how Israel is able to target innocent children with such deadly accuracy, and no one can tell you. Well, I can tell you. They're supplied with some of the best weapons available, and the 99 medical professionals did tell us from their observations in their letter that children are universally considered innocents in armed conflict. However, every single signatory to this letter saw children in Gaza who suffered violence that must have been deliberately directed at them. Specifically, every one of us who worked in an emergency intensive care or surgical setting treated preteen children who were shot in the head or chest on a regular or even a daily basis. It is impossible that such widespread shooting of young children throughout Gaza, sustained over the course of an entire year, is accidental or unknown to the highest Israeli civilian and military authorities. I hope Howard Jacobson sees that. Like, I really hope he sees it. Just on a personal note, I think it's disgraceful to deny the slaughter of Palestinian children by using the idea of blood libel, saying it's comparable to blood libel. It's not. And Jacobson's article about alleged blood libel also says, ask why they would want to target innocent children and make themselves despised among the nations of the earth, and no one can tell you that either. Well, I can give you a fairly simple explanation for why. Killing and preventing reproduction within the group is a way, in a way that is calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. How's that for an explanation? So, if you don't want to comment on Jacobson's article, I totally understand. But I will ask you about the article. I was going to say article letter by the 99 medical professionals. What is it that you take from what you've seen of it? I don't know if you've caught it in the news, but I hope that's given you a glimpse of what it's like. And yeah, how should Biden and Harris, and how should the rest of us be responding? Is this something we should be pushing to the forefront right now?
Most definitely. I actually feel calling for an arms embargo and a ceasefire isn't enough. I know that 365 days ago, it's what we started calling for, a ceasefire. But at the very root of this problem is the occupation, an illegal occupation of another's land. And that's what we need to be focusing more towards, is not just a ceasefire and an arms embargo on all parties, but an end to the illegal occupation, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and oppression of the Palestinian people. That is, in my mind, the only way that we are ever going to resolve this matter, is to end the occupation itself. However that looks is dependent on what happens within bodies such as the UN and on Palestinians themselves, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who should be making this decision for themselves, not anybody else. It's not America's place, Britain's place, or even Israel's place to dictate how the Palestinians govern themselves and govern their lands. It is their home, no one other's. So I fully support the letter of these medical professionals. My father was a paramedic, and so he's seen an awful lot in his time too, and has told stories. I can very easily empathize with the sorrow and the pain of each one of the healthcare professionals that have been in Gaza and have witnessed what they have done. Yeah, and in regards to Jacobson's article itself, I did give it a read through this afternoon, and it appears to me very much, you said the word yourself, denial, but denial by deflection. It's denying the facts on the ground that 17,000 children at the very minimum, because this is a conservative estimate on those who have been identified by a health professional within a hospital in Gaza, anyone whose body didn't make it to a hospital hasn't been registered. So it's very likely that we're looking at tens of thousands more children than the 17,000 we are aware of currently.
That's a good point.
And the way in which he portrays this as a potential subconscious blood libel, it gives me the same vibe as the malicious and falsified allegations of anti-Semitism that have been pulled towards those who have even criticized Israel in order to silence them. And it very much feels like the same sort of maneuver and technique. Now that, because of the misuse and abuse of the term of anti-Semitism and allegations of anti-Semitism to silence critics, which has very dangerously watered down the actual meaning and impact of real anti-Semitic attacks on the Jewish community. I think this is a very similar tactic that is being taken in this article. And when you look at the other articles that Jacobson has written within The Observer, you see a very similar pattern. Now, it is an editorial, it's an opinion piece, and so we have to bear in mind that the author, any author of an opinion piece, is going to be putting their personal opinion forward, which is going to be embedded with their own biases and prejudice. And we see this throughout the article itself. And it does come across as a denial of Palestinian deaths and murders of Palestinian children in order to deflect away from the reality of the fact that, yes, thousands of children have been murdered, so many, in fact, that we cannot just pass it off as simply collateral damage. This is, as the healthcare workers have said, we've had children being admitted into hospital who have been sniped straight through the forehead. And that is not an accident. Snipers do not make accidents like that. They are trained to be able to take precise headshots. And if you are having children, some as young as 5, 6 years old, coming into hospital with a bullseye on their forehead, you know that is not an accidental shot in any shape or form and cannot be claimed to be. And so I do feel that Jacobson is trying to deflect from the reality and change the narrative, and also present, much like how the misuse and abuse of allegations of anti-Semitism is doing the same with blood libel, which is, for intents and purposes, a much more serious allegation of anti-Semitic behaviors than simply accusing someone of being anti-Semitic.
Yes.
And we see them take this argument when they have no validity to counter the reality on the ground. And that's when I see this argument come through more often, is when those who are opposed to Palestinian liberation, are opposed to talking about the realities of what is happening in Palestine to the Palestinians, they don't have an argument against it. They don't have a valid justification for it. So they will pull this out of their hat as a way to silence anybody and change the narrative. And to me, it's just another repeat of that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that defines blood libel is the fact that it just isn't true. There's some anti-Semitic tropes which have like hints of truth to them. For example, Jewish people being overrepresented in finance. That is technically true. It's not the truth value that makes it anti-Semitic. It's the stereotyping makes it anti-Semitic because precisely of the false alignment. By the way, they're also represented in things like education. What makes it anti-Semitic is the lack of explanation for why that is the case. It's because for years and years and years, Jewish people were only allowed, because of rules made under King John here in England, Jewish people were only allowed to work in certain fields, one of them being finance. And they were literally restricted to those fields. They couldn't practice things like law and professions that other people could practice at the time. And so they're being restricted to those professions. You see how that history builds up and the anti-Semitic trope builds up. Blood libel is slightly different, though. Blood libel is always something that is built on a complete mistruth and untruth, and building on people's fears about their children, and fears about their children being targeted by the other, the outsider. And xenophobic tropes, typically that sort of like centers around. It does make me think of like people's care for their pets and the Haitians are eating your dogs and cats stuff from the US and Donald Trump right now. I did also want to comment on impartial observers. I thought it was really interesting that the 99 healthcare professionals made a point of saying that they are impartial observers. And it's interesting that we know aid workers have been targeted, like in Gaza. We know that for 100%. But there's an interesting parallel I always like to draw between the way that the Syrian civil defense, the white helmets in Syria, were portrayed as members of ISIS by Assad and by the Russians in order to justify attacks on them directly in order to maximize the harm to civilians, and the way that this has also been done in Gaza, representing the UNHCR as UNHCR. What do I mean? UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, as a wing of Hamas, or having Hamas fighters in that they didn't provide evidence for. And funding has been restored to those organizations. The targeting of World Central Kitchen workers, saying, oh, well, there was a Hamas militant somewhere nearby. We see this consistently. The targeting of aid workers is one of those things where you only do that if you're trying to blur the lines, right? You only do that if you're trying to cover something up.